Welcome back, everyone! Today, we have an incredibly gripping story, shared by a Reddit user who lived through a heart-wrenching betrayal and a revenge plan so subtle, yet devastating, it will leave you speechless. This tale unfolds with the kind of emotional intensity that you might never expect, turning what seemed like an ordinary marriage into a twisted game of guilt, regret, and relentless consequences. This isn't just a story about cheating, it's about the kind of revenge that doesn't scream for attention but quietly, carefully, leaves a lasting scar. As the story progresses, you'll witness the devastating transformation of a loving wife into someone trapped in her own lies, unable to escape the psychological maze she's created. And the husband, he's a master of silent retribution, plotting every move with chilling precision. So sit back, because what you're about to hear is one of the most unexpected and thought-provoking stories you'll ever come across. Grab some popcorn, because this is not your typical love story, it's a tale of betrayal, revenge, and haunting consequences. Let's dive in a quaint little town where secrets were rarely kept. Nathan and Sarah appeared to be the picture of marital bliss. They had been married for over a decade, shared a beautiful home, and were the couple everyone admired. Nathan, a quiet, reflective man, was deeply in love with Sarah, and he believed she felt the same. Yet, as they say, not everything that glitters is gold. Beneath the warmth of their love lay dark shadows, lurking silently, waiting to reveal themselves. It all began with small, almost insignificant changes. Sarah started coming home late, her clothes faintly smelling of unfamiliar cologne. She was suddenly glued to her phone, often laughing at messages she kept hidden from Nathan's view. At first, he brushed it off. She was busy with work, had new friends trusted her, but the signs became harder to ignore. The missed dinners, the hushed phone calls, the increasing distance between them. Nathan's heart ached, but he knew he couldn't confront her without proof. So he decided to follow her. One chilly night, he watched as Sarah left their house, glancing over her shoulder as though she was making sure he wouldn't see her. Unbeknownst to her, Nathan followed, careful to stay hidden. His stomach churned with anxiety, but he was determined to find out the truth. Sarah met a man in a dimly lit restaurant, their faces illuminated by soft candlelight. Nathan's heart dropped as he watched them lean toward each other, sharing tender glances and secret smiles. Rage and heartbreak twisted within him, but he managed to keep his cool, vowing to confront her on his own terms. But instead of an immediate confrontation, he decided to wait to plan. Revenge, he decided, would be his way of setting things right. He would make her feel the pain she'd caused him, but he wouldn't shout or accuse her, would be patient, calculated. Over the following weeks, Nathan continued to watch, documenting her every lie, every whispered conversation, every moment she spent with her lover. The betrayal felt like poison, slowly seeping into his soul, but he refused to let it break him. He used that pain to fuel his plan, determined to make her regret every deceitful act. One evening, he decided to subtly start his game. He didn't hide his knowledge, but instead dropped hints in their daily life just enough to make her nervous. When she came home from her work meeting, he would ask casually if she had a good time. He began leaving little notes around the house, messages that seemed innocent but were filled with double meanings. Trust is a beautiful thing, don't you think? One note read, left on the kitchen counter where she would find it. Another time, he left a book open on their bed titled ****, the truth always comes out ****. At first, Sarah brushed it off, chalking it up to coincidence. But as days passed, she began to sense a change. The tension grew, and she felt eyes on her even when she was alone. She started losing sleep, haunted by an inexplicable dread. She grew paranoid, jumping at every shadow, wondering if Nathan knew. And he let her wonder, never once confronting her outright, but always letting her feel the weight of her guilt, the looming presence of her secret. The turning point came when he invited her to a weekend getaway. It was at his secluded cabin, far from the prying eyes of the town, where Nathan unveiled his final act. The place was filled with little reminders of the life they'd built, towards their photos, keepsakes, memories she had once treasured. He asked her about each one, his tone calm, his expression unreadable. Sarah's face grew pale as she realized he was hinting at her betrayal without saying a word. Finally, she broke down, admitting to everything in a fit of guilt and desperation, hoping he would forgive her. But Nathan only smiled, a cold, unforgiving smile that sent chills down her spine. Revenge, he said quietly, is a dish best served cold. With that, he left her there in the empty cabin, surrounded by memories of a love she had thrown away. But he wasn't done. There were still layers to his plan, pieces of her life that would unravel as she tried to rebuild. Nathan's vengeance wasn't about anger, it was about showing her the depth of her betrayal, the emptiness it left behind, and the void she would have to live with, forever wondering what other pieces of her life he had set to fall apart. and if the anger that had once burned so hot inside him was now replaced by a chilling satisfaction. He didn't hate Sarah, in fact, that was the most unsettling part. His love for her was still there, buried under layers of betrayal and disappointment, but his love had turned cold, a distant memory that now fueled his desire to see her feel the emptiness he felt every day. After that weekend, he returned home alone. He didn't reach out to her, didn't answer her calls, and acted as if she had simply vanished. He left no clues for her, no indication of what he was planning next. But Nathan had already set things in motion that would dismantle the life she'd so carefully built. Nathan knew that her lover, Mark, worked in a high-profile position in a neighboring town. Mark was well-respected, and his company had a strict policy against workplace relationships. Nathan sent an anonymous email to the company's HR department, hinting at an affair between Mark and a married woman, complete with carefully chosen photos and dates that matched Sarah's absences. The email was crafted to raise suspicions without giving away Nathan's identity. Within days, Mark was under investigation. Sarah, sensing her relationship with Mark was unraveling, grew more desperate, trying to reach out to Nathan for comfort. But each time she called, he left her messages unanswered. Her once orderly life began to spiral out of control, and she found herself isolated, with no one to turn to. Her friends, sensing her distress but knowing nothing of her secrets, watched as she withdrew further into herself, haunted by the consequences of her choices. Meanwhile, Nathan continued his quiet assault. He changed the passwords to their joint accounts, moved funds around in ways she couldn't trace, and began consulting a lawyer about a strategic, silent divorce process. Sarah, feeling the financial strain and unable to access their savings, grew panicked and began sending him desperate messages, pleading for forgiveness, asking him to let her explain. But Nathan stayed silent, letting her confusion and regret deepen. Then came the day Sarah's colleagues started whispering. It seemed that a certain anonymous tip had reached her workplace, subtly revealing her affair. Rumors spread, and though no one confronted her directly, Sarah began to feel the weight of judgment everywhere she went. She could see the pitying looks, hear the hushed voices behind her back, and felt herself becoming a stranger among her own friends and colleagues. In the end, her relationship with Mark disintegrated under the pressure. He too began to avoid her, his own reputation at stake. The very man she had risked everything for became yet another stranger, leaving her alone to pick up the shattered pieces of her life. Finally, Nathan allowed her to reach him. They met at a cafe, the same cafe where he had once watched her laugh with Mark, unaware of his presence. She looked worn, a shadow of the woman she once was, her confidence gone. She pleaded with him, asked him for forgiveness, begged him to take her back. Nathan listened quietly, his face unreadable. "Why did you do this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why did you make me feel this way?" He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze cold but calm. "Because you needed to understand what it feels like to be left in the dark, to wonder if the life you thought you knew is all a lie." She lowered her gaze, the weight of his words crushing her spirit. For the first time, she saw the full extent of the damage she had caused. The life she once cherished lay in ruins around her, and there was no way to go back. But Nathan wasn't finished yet. "Now," he said, his voice even, "it's your turn to start over. To pick up the pieces. Alone." He stood, paid for his coffee, and left her there, alone with her guilt and regret. Months passed, and Sarah tried to rebuild her life. She moved to a smaller apartment, found a new job, and kept to herself, haunted by the memories of what she had lost. And every once in a while, she would see a note slipped under her door or an anonymous message in her inbox, reminding her that someone knew her story, that someone was watching. She would never be free from Nathan's quiet vengeance, never fully escape the ghost of the love she had betrayed. And as she went through her days, she realized with a sense of dread that he had left her with a punishment far worse than any confrontation or argument. He had left her with silence, with guilt, and with pardons. Unyielding knowledge that revenge, truly, is a dish best served cold. As Nathan drove away from the cabin, a sense of calm washed over him. It was as if he had shed a heavy burden he'd been carrying for months. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't shattered the house with accusations or anger, had simply let Sarah crumble under the weight of her own guilt. But his revenge was far from over. Nathan knew Sarah wouldn't be able to return to the life she once had so easily. He had prepared for this carefully, knowing exactly which strings to pull to ensure her descent would be slow and agonizing. The first step in his plan was subtle. Sarah returned to their town a few days later, looking gaunt and haunted. Her love, whom she'd thought of as a haven from her marital troubles, had suddenly stopped responding to her messages. When she called him, there was no answer. She had no idea that Nathan had already reached out to the man, revealing just enough details to let him know that being with Sarah was a dangerous choice. Sarah's lover, frightened by the intensity of Nathan's quiet threats, wanted nothing more to do with her. He blocked her number and disappeared from her life without a trace. As the weeks passed, Sarah began to feel the walls closing in. Her friends, once warm and welcoming, seemed distant and suspicious. Nathan had shared subtle hints with a few close acquaintances, carefully spinning a narrative without ever directly accusing her of anything. Rumors spread, casting a shadow of doubt over Sarah's reputation. She felt like she was constantly being watched, scrutinized. The once confident woman found herself second-guessing everything. At work, where she had once been respected and admired, her colleagues whispered behind her back, wondering why her husband seemed so distant and why she often appeared anxious and flustered. Her performance started to slip, and she found herself isolated, surrounded by people who looked at her with a mixture of pity and disdain. Everywhere she turned, Sarah saw reminders of the life she had betrayed. Nathan ensured that her social media was filled with pictures from the past, happy memories of vacations, anniversaries, family gatherings. He posted these images without a word, leaving them as silent reminders of what they'd lost, visible to everyone who knew them. Friends and family commented, expressing fond memories and longing for the good old days, unaware of the turmoil beneath the surface. Sarah could barely stand to look at the screen, each image feeling like a knife twisting in her heart. As winter settled over the town, Nathan took one last step in his carefully crafted plan. He filed for divorce, but did so quietly, notifying Sarah through a lawyer instead of telling her in person. The letter came on a cold, dark morning, slipping through her mailbox like a ghostly messenger. The words were clinical and detached, a stark contrast to the warmth they'd once shared. She realized then that Nathan was truly done with her, his silence more painful than any shouted words. But the final twist came just days before the divorce was set to be finalized. Nathan had arranged for a small, private dinner with a few friends and family members, including Sarah. She accepted, hoping she could at least repair her image and leave with some shred of dignity. But as the evening unfolded, Nathan revealed a small box he'd prepared, filled with photos, notes, and mementos of their life together, all dated meticulously. He gave a speech about the importance of trust and honesty, never once mentioning her betrayal but allowing the weight of his words to hang heavy in the room. Sarah could feel her face burning, the shame coursing through her as everyone around the table looked on with a mixture of confusion and sympathy. Nathan's words were like a knife, each sentence cutting through her carefully constructed defenses. By the end of the evening, she was a shell of the person she once was, and Nathan's quiet revenge was complete. He left her standing there in the dim glow of the restaurant, her former friends turning away as they left, not meeting her eyes. In a cold, detached way, Nathan had torn down her defenses, leaving her raw and exposed in front of the people she cared about, was worse than any yelling or accusations. It was as though he had cast a spell, leaving her trapped in her own guilt and regret with no way to escape. Days turned into weeks, and each one seemed more unbearable than the last. Sarah was haunted by memories of her life with Nat, and her kindness in his eyes, the way he used to laugh with her, the gentle touch she had once taken for granted. Now, every memory felt like a reminder of what she had destroyed. She couldn't go anywhere without being reminded of him. The places they used to go, the people they used to meet, it was as if the whole town was filled with echoes of their life together. Nathan, meanwhile, had moved on, or so it seemed. He had started traveling more often, posting pictures of himself at scenic locations, hiking trails, and weekend trips to new places. Sarah couldn't tear her eyes away from Nathan's social media, despite the pain it brought her. Every photo he posted seemed like a reminder that he was building a new life without her, a life she could no longer be part of. She felt herself slowly unraveling, trapped in a cycle of regret and longing that she could neither escape nor satisfy. As she scrolled through his feed late one night, her fingers trembling, she noticed something she hadn't before. In one of his recent photos, Nathan stood on a cliffside overlooking a vast ocean. His face was peaceful, his expression almost triumphant, and beside him, partially obscured by his shoulder, was the faint silhouette of a woman. Sarah's heart dropped. She zoomed in, her mind racing, but the woman's face was barely visible. Was she someone new in Nathan's life? Someone who had already begun to replace her? Sleep eluded her that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying all the memories of their marriage, both the beautiful moments and the bitter ones. She felt a mix of jealousy, guilt, and sorrow. The thought that Nathan had already moved on, that he had perhaps found someone who made him happy in a way she hadn't, was unbearable. She wondered if this was all part of his revenge, the final act of a well-crafted plan to break her. The following weeks turned into a slow descent into despair for Sarah. Every day, she found herself glancing at her phone, her heart pounding as she checked for new updates from Nathan, terrified and yet compelled to see what he was doing. And with each post he shared, she found herself more and more haunted by the idea that she had been nothing but a phase in his life, something to discard and forget. She began to feel like a ghost, wandering through her own life, burdened by memories that now only served as reminders of her mistakes. In an attempt to gain some closure, or perhaps out of desperation, Sarah finally reached out to Nathan. She sent him a message, apologizing for everything, pleading for a chance to talk. She felt that if she could just explain, if he could see her remorse, maybe she could at least begin to heal, to move forward from the torment she'd put herself through. Nathan took days to respond. When he finally did, his answer was short and to the point. He agreed to meet her, but only on his terms, a public place, short conversation. Sarah clung to this tiny lifeline, feeling a spark of hope that maybe this meeting could help her understand how to put the pieces of her shattered life back together. The day of the meeting arrived. She chose a quiet cafe they had often visited together during the early days of their marriage. The memories were bittersweet, reminding her of a time when she had felt secure and loved, when everything had seemed so simple and full of promise. She sat by the window, nervously fidgeting, waiting for Nathan. When he walked in, he looked different, stronger, more confident, as though he had shed a weight she had never noticed before. He met her gaze, his face unreadable, and sat down across from her. For a moment, they were silent, the weight of unspoken words heavy between them. "Thank you for meeting me," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I don't deserve it." Nathan nodded but said nothing, his eyes focused on her with a calm intensity that made her feel exposed, as though he could see right through her. I don't know where to start," she continued, her voice trembling. "I've made so many mistakes, and I know I can never undo them. But I want you to know that I regret everything. I lost something precious, and it was all my fault." Nathan's expression didn't change. He listened, allowing her to pour out her apologies, her regrets, her guilt. When she finished, there was a long silence. She felt as though her heart had been laid bare, vulnerable and raw. Finally, he spoke. "Sarah, I appreciate you saying that, but I want you to understand something." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "I spent months wondering what I did wrong, what I could have done differently. I questioned everything, every part of our life together. And then I realized it wasn't about me. It was a choice you made." Sarah flinched, his words hitting her like a blow. She felt the sting of his calm, measured tone, each word a reminder of her betrayal. "I've moved on, Sarah," he continued, his voice steady. "I've found peace. I don't hate you, and I don't wish you harm, but I don't have a place for you in my life anymore." She felt as if the ground had been ripped out from under her. She had expected anger, perhaps even a glimmer of forgiveness, but his indifference was far worse. It was as though she was a stranger to him, someone who had once mattered but was now irrelevant. Nathan looked at her for a moment, a faint sadness in his eyes. "I hope you find peace, Sarah, but it won't be with me." With that, he stood, leaving her sitting alone in the cafe, her heart shattered. She watched him walk away, feeling as though she had lost him all over again. She realized then that her punishment wasn't his anger or his coldness, it was the knowledge that she had lost something irreplaceable, something she could never reclaim. In the following weeks, Sarah's life continued to spiral. She lost focus at work, her relationships with friends became strained, and the emptiness she felt grew unbearable. The memories of her life with Nathan haunted her, filling her with regret and self-loathing. She tried to fill the void with distractions, but nothing seemed to ease the ache in her heart. Months passed, and Sarah became a shell of the person she had once been. She avoided social events, spent most of her time alone, and even moved to a different part of town, hoping that a change of scenery would help her escape the memories that haunted her. But no matter where she went, she couldn't escape herself, couldn't shake the feeling of loss and regret that weighed on her soul. One evening, she sat alone in her apartment, going through an old photo album from her life with Nathan. She traced her fingers over the photos, remembering the laughter, the warmth, the love that had once filled her life. Tears filled her eyes as she realized that she had taken it all for granted, that she had let something beautiful slip through her fingers. The pain was a constant reminder of her choices, of the life she had destroyed with her own hands. And she knew that this was her true punishment, alive with the memories of what could have been, knowing that she had no one to blame but herself. Nathan, on the other hand, found peace. He continued his journey, traveling, meeting new people, building a life he could be proud of. He had loved Sarah once, but he had learned to let go, to move forward without looking back. and in doing so, he had freed himself from the pain of her betrayal, leaving her trapped in the very prison she had built for herself. In the end, Sarah understood that revenge wasn't always loud or violent. Sometimes, it was as quiet as the emptiness left behind, as silent as the memories that haunted her dreams. She had changed apartments several times, each move in the hope of escaping memories that seemed to linger wherever she went. But those memories weren't confined to one place. They followed her, silent specters reminding her of the love she'd once had, the warmth she'd taken for granted, and the emptiness that now filled her days. Her career suffered. Once an ambitious, successful woman, she was now known for being distracted, withdrawn, and inconsistent. Her colleagues had stopped inviting her out, sensing something broken within her. She spent most evenings alone, often revisiting the remnants of her life with Nathan, the photo albums, the notes, the gifts that had once been so meaningful. Each item was a token of the happiness she had cast aside, a reminder of the life she had carelessly shattered. On one particularly lonely night, Sarah found herself scrolling through social media, a habit she developed despite the pain it often brought her. She stumbled upon Nathan's profile, and she couldn't help but click on it, curiosity overtaking the painful memories. His profile had changed since the last time she had looked. His pictures were no longer just solo shots of scenic landscapes or travel destinations. No, there was someone by his side. Nathan's new life was full of warmth, laughter, and companionship. In the photos, he stood beside a woman who looked genuinely happy, her smile bright and unburdened. They looked at each other with a tenderness that was unmistakable. The sight left Sarah reeling, an ache spreading through her chest as she stared at their joyful expressions. She could see that Nathan had truly moved on, that he had found the happiness she'd once shared with him, but now with someone else. He had found the peace that she couldn't, and the knowledge felt like a final, irrevocable blow. Yet, in the quiet depths of that pain, Sarah felt something else stirring, something beyond regret. It was a realization, an understanding that had been creeping up on her all these years but had never quite reached the surface until this moment. She understood now that her punishment was not only the loss of Nathan but the loss of her own sense of self. She had betrayed not just him but the person she had once been, the person she'd aspired to become. And now, that self seemed forever out of reach. Desperate to break free from the ghosts that haunted her, Sarah decided to seek professional help. She enrolled in therapy, facing the painful truths she had long tried to ignore. She spoke about her guilt, her regrets, and the choices that had led her to this isolated existence. Week by week, she dug into her past, confronting the parts of herself that she had once been too afraid to face. Therapy was grueling, forcing her to examine her motivations, her insecurities, and the wounds that had festered for years, unacknowledged and untreated. Through these sessions, Sarah began to understand the deeper reasons behind her choice: fear of vulnerability, the craving for validation, the inability to recognize the worth of what she already had. She realized that her affair hadn't been about love or excitement. It had been a desperate attempt to fill an emptiness that no one else could ever satisfy. She had searched for something outside herself, believing that happiness could be found in someone new, only to learn too late that true contentment had to come from within. Slowly, Sarah began to rebuild herself. She found new routines, new interests, things she had once ignored in her pursuit of external validation. She started painting, a hobby she'd abandoned years ago, finding solace in the quiet hours she spent with a brush in her hand, colors spilling across the canvas. She volunteered at local shelters, spending her weekends with animals in need, feeling a kind of fulfillment that she hadn't known before. She even started taking long walks, rediscovering the beauty of the town she'd once wanted to leave, and learning to find peace in her own company. Over time, Sarah's life began to change in subtle ways. She was no longer the vibrant woman she had once been, nor was she the broken person she'd become in the aftermath of her betrayal. She was something new, quieter, perhaps, but also more grounded, more self-aware. She no longer sought validation from others, no longer looked to someone else to fill the void within her. She had learned, finally, that peace was something she had to create for herself. But the scars of her past remained, a reminder of the lessons she had learned the hard way. Nathan's image still visited her dreams, but now, instead of pain, there was a kind of acceptance. She could see him for who he was, someone she had loved and lost, a chapter in her life that was over. She wished him happiness, hoping that his life with his new partner was filled with the joy she had failed to provide. One winter's evening, Sarah decided to take a final step in her journey. She wrote a letter to Nathan, though she had no intention of sending it. In it, she poured out all the things she had wanted to say but had never found the courage to express. She thanked him for the years they had shared, for the love he had given her, and for the forgiveness he had shown, even if it was only through his quiet acceptance of her absence. She wrote of her regrets, of the painful growth she had endured, and of the lessons she had learned. And as she finished the letter, a sense of closure washed over her, a gentle release from the past. Sarah burned the letter that night, watching the flames consume the words, the smoke curling up into the winter sky. It was her way of letting go, of accepting that her life was her own to shape from this point forward. The past was behind her, no longer a weight she carried but a memory, a reminder of a journey that had brought her to where she was now. Years passed, and Sarah continued her quiet, steady path of self-discovery. She never remarried, nor did she seek out new romantic relationships. Instead, she found fulfillment in her own life, in the friendships she had nurtured, in the art she created, and in the peace she had finally found within herself. The ghost of her old life had faded, and in its place was something stronger, something unbreakable. Nathan, too, moved on, building a family and creating a life filled with love and joy. They never spoke again, but their lives were forever intertwined, each carrying the memory of what had once been and what had been lost. And though Sarah still thought of him from time to time, it was with a quiet sense of gratitude, a respect for the role he had played in her journey. In the end, Sarah's life was not what she had once envisioned, but it was her own, shaped by the choices she had made and the lessons she had learned. And as she looked back on her life, she understood that true peace had been worth the pain, worth the regret. Her story was one of loss and growth, of betrayal and redemption, a story of learning, finally, that the only person who could truly heal her was herself.